Bukovich is not one that I killed, so I don't know nothing about him.
There are all kinds of disturbing reasons serial killers often commit their heinous crimes, some of which may include psychological disorders, a need for power and control, how about traumatic childhood experiences, or just twisted desires for thrill and notoriety, really making their motives complex and horrifyingly fascinating. So here are 10 disturbing reasons why serial killers commit their crimes. Holmes, known and regarded as America's first serial killer, confessed to 27 murders, though some estimates put the number higher, during the late 19th century. However, the motive behind his crime is as shocking as the crime he committed. Born Herman Webster Mudgett on May 16, 1861, in Gilmanton, New Hampshire, Holmes would display signs of a disturbed mind from an early age, reportedly torturing animals and engaging in other gruesome activities. Now, his morbid curiosity would extend to human anatomy, which he pursued through his medical studies at the University of Michigan. Without anyone really suspecting him, his criminal career would begin with insurance fraud schemes, where he would take out policies on fictitious people and then collect on their supposed deaths. His charm and intelligence allowed him to defraud numerous victims, but it was in Chicago that he would cement his legacy as a mass murderer. In 1886, Holmes moved to Chicago and took over a pharmacy, later purchasing an empty lot across the street where he constructed a 3-story building that would become infamous as the Murder Castle, officially known as the World's Fair Hotel. It was designed to cater to visitors of the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition. However, the building was like a labyrinth, with soundproof rooms, secret passageways, trapdoors, and a basement equipped with a crematorium and acid vats, making it a true house of horrors. Holmes' mode of operation involved luring his victims, often young women, under the pretense of employment or lodging. Once inside, they would fall prey to his deadly schemes. He would suffocate, gas, or otherwise kill his victims, subsequently disposing the bodies in the basement. He would conduct gruesome experiments on some of his victims, selling their skeletons to medical schools. The facade of his legitimacy allowed Holmes to continue his murderous activities for several years. However, his downfall began with another insurance scam, in which he conspired to fake the death of his business associate, Benjamin Petezel. Instead of faking Petezel's death, Holmes killed him and went on to kill his 3 children. This drew the attention of law enforcement and, of course, the insurance company. Now, Holmes would be eventually arrested in 1894 in Boston after being tracked by the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, the pre-FBI. The tragedy within the Murder Castle led to a sensational trial, where Holmes confessed to 27 murders, although some estimates put the number of his victims at over 200. His articulate and calm demeanor in court only added to the public's fascination and horror. And what was more horrifying was the reason he gave for the crimes committed, which was firstly for financial gain and secondly just for the thrill of it. Pretty insane, right? But on May 7th, 1896, Holmes was executed by hanging in Philadelphia. His case has been the subject of numerous books, documentaries, and films, perpetuating his notoriety as a master manipulator and cold-blooded killer. July 1982. The body of Ridgway's first known victim was found by the Green River, Utah, where a unique kind of spray paint was found on clothing wrapped around the victim's neck. However, the murder couldn't be linked to him, and this would only become one of many gruesome murders, making him one of America's most prolific serial killers. Born February 18, 1949, in Salt Lake City, Utah, Ridgway had a troubled childhood, characterized by a turbulent relationship with a domineering mother and a bedwetting issue that led to humiliation. Now, these early experiences were said to have contributed to his later psychological disturbances, but in his early adulthood, he appeared relatively normal as he served in the U.S. Navy, and after being discharged, he worked as a truck painter for nearly 30 years. He even married 3 times and had a son, living a seemingly ordinary life in the Seattle area. However, beneath this whole facade lay a deeply disturbed individual with a growing compulsion to kill. His infamous murder spree would begin in the early 80s, where he targeted vulnerable women, primarily sex workers and runaways, whom he picked up along Pacific Highway South in Seattle. His method was chillingly efficient. as he would gain their trust, often showing them pictures of his son before strangling them to death, typically with his bare hands or using ligatures. He would then dump their bodies in remote wooded areas, and then often return for some engaging necrophilia. The first known victims were discovered in the Green River, leading to his moniker, Green River Killer. And as that body count rose, fear and panic would spread throughout the community. But despite this extensive investigation and the involvement of various law enforcement agencies, including the FBI, Ridgway managed to evade capture for nearly 2 decades. His ability to blend into society and the transient nature of his victims really made it difficult for authorities to track him down. So after this lengthy manhunt, Ridgway was finally apprehended in 2001 after DNA evidence would link him to 4 of the victims. Forensic advancements would link DNA samples to Ridgway, sealing his fate. So in the face of overwhelming evidence, Ridgway was forced to cut a deal with prosecutors to avoid the death penalty by confessing to the murders and providing information about the locations of additional victims. In the course of interrogation, we discovered the main motive behind his gruesome crimes, which was simply a hatred for women, which would bring about sexual sadism. In 2003, Ridgway was eventually convicted of 48 murders, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in U.S. history. He later confessed to more killings, bringing the total to at least 71, and the true number could be even higher. Ridgway's confessions and cooperation with authorities led to the recovery of numerous remains, providing closure to many families. Ridgway eventually received a life sentence without the possibility of parole, and thank God this guy is spending the rest of his days behind bars. 1978 was the year Chikatilo gruesomely killed a girl, Yelena Zagatnova, marking the beginning of a killing spree that earned him the moniker Butcher of Rostov and the Rostov Ripper. Born October 16, 1936, in Yablushnik, Ukraine, Chikatilo grew up during a time of immense hardship, including the Holodomor famine and World War II. Now, these early experiences, coupled with a dysfunctional family life and social isolation, contributed greatly to his later psychological disturbances. Chikatilo's early adult life was seemingly unremarkable. He attended Rostov University, got married, and had 2 children. He even worked as a teacher, but his career was marred by accusations of misconduct, leading to his eventual dismissal. This then made him take up various menial jobs, but his dark urges began surfacing in a much more sinister way. His killing spree began in 1978 when he killed Yelena Zagatnova, and over the next 12 years, Chikatilo would go on to murder at least 52 women and children, though a lot of people say the number could be much higher. His MO was also gruesome, as he lured his victims into secluded areas, where he would then brutally assault, mutilate, and murder them. Chikatilo was said to have derived sexual pleasure from the act of killing and mutilation, often engaging in necrophilia and cannibalism. Wow! Despite the growing number of victims, the investigation was hampered by a combination of factors, including the Soviet government's reluctance to acknowledge the existence of serial killers and the lack of modern forensics. At this point, they arrested numerous innocent men, even executing them for crimes they didn't commit. At long last, Chikatilo's downfall would come in 1990, when he was arrested near a railway station in Rostov-on-Don after some suspicious behavior. Initially, there would be a lack of concrete evidence, but a more thorough investigation would reveal his guilt. It would be the advances in forensic science, including blood and semen analysis, that linked him to several crime scenes. During his trial, which began in 1992, Chikatilo confessed in graphic detail to numerous gruesome murders. In court, his behavior was erratic and often disturbing, shocking the public and world at large. He was found guilty of 52 murders and eventually sentenced to death. On February 14, 1994, Andrei Chikatilo was executed by a single gunshot to the back of the head. His case exposed significant flaws in the Soviets' criminal justice system, and it remains a chilling example of how low human depravity can go. 1966, Pedro Alonso Lopez, who earned the moniker the Monster of the Andes, committed his first murder, which marked the beginning of his reign of terror. However, what was most disturbing was the loose grip the authorities had on him, which led to his unknown end. Now, born on October 8, 1948, in Santa Isabel, Colombia, Lopez's early life was severely traumatic and unstable. Imagine being the seventh child of 13 in a poverty-stricken family. Pretty bad. And on top of that, his mother was a prostitute who subjected him to physical and sexual abuse. So at the age of 8, Lopez was kicked out of the house for molesting his sister, leading him to a life on the streets. Lopez's life on these streets of Bogota was pretty brutal. He was repeatedly assaulted and eventually taken by an American expatriate who enrolled him in a school for orphans. However, after escaping and falling into criminal activities, Lopez's behavior became increasingly violent and deviant. He claimed to have committed his first murder at the age of 18, targeting girls. In the 1970s, his killing spree spread across Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador. He targeted these girls, often approaching them in public places and luring them away with promises of gifts. He would take his victims to secluded areas, where he would assault and strangle them. His method was chillingly consistent, and he often buried the bodies in mass graves. So eventually, Lopez's arrest came in 1980 in Ecuador after an attempted abduction went wrong. At first, the police didn't believe him when he told them he killed hundreds of people, considering it an exaggeration or just a tactic to avoid severe punishment. However, after Lopez led authorities to the graves of over 50 girls, the horrifying truth became undeniable. It was at this point of the interrogation that his motive for killing became clear. This guy was a sexual sadist, meaning that he loved torturing and killing his victims for sexual excitement and orgasm. In other words, he's a psychopath. Eventually, Lopez was convicted of 110 murders in Ecuador, even though he confessed to killing over 300 girls. Despite the enormity of his crimes, he was given just 16 years in prison due to Ecuador's lenient penal system. The crazy thing is, he served 14 years and was released in 1994 for good behavior. After his release, he was deported to Colombia, where he was committed straight to a psychiatric hospital. Astonishingly, he was declared sane and released in 1998 on bail, and all of a sudden, his whereabouts became unknown. There's a bunch of rumors out there that he continues his involvement in some criminal activities, but he remains at large. One might wonder, despite knowing his condition as a psychotic killer, why was he left to go on bail without supervision? Mary Ann Nichols was the first of many victims gruesomely murdered by the infamous Jack the Ripper. Now, this mystery surrounding the killer is as dark as it is unimaginable. First of all, Jack the Ripper's just an infamous moniker given to an unidentified serial killer who terrorized the Whitechapel district of London in 1888. His gruesome crimes, characterized by the murder and mutilation of female prostitutes, have become one of the most enduring mysteries in criminal history. The first confirmed victim, Mary Ann Nichols, found August 31, 1888. Her throat slashed and her abdomen mutilated. Over the next few months, 4 more women, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, each one would display increasing levels of savagery, with the killer showing anatomical knowledge, leading to speculation that he might have been a surgeon or a butcher. The Ripper style involved attacking his victims in the early morning hours, typically before dawn, in secluded areas of Whitechapel. After incapacitating them with swift cuts to the throat, he would proceed to mutilate their bodies. His precision would suggest familiarity with the human anatomy, which would surprise investigators and fuel widespread public fear and fascination. There was a police investigation led by Detective Inspector Frederick Aberline that faced numerous challenges. The densely populated and impoverished area of Whitechapel, coupled with limited forensic technology, made it difficult to gather substantial evidence. The press sensationalized the murders, creating a climate of hysteria and speculation. Numerous letters, purportedly from the killer, were sent to the police and media, with the most famous being the Dear Boss letter, which first introduced the name Jack the Ripper. Now, despite exhaustive efforts, the police were unable to apprehend him or her. Several suspects were considered, including Montague John Druitt, a barrister, Aaron Kosminski, a Polish immigrant with a history of mental illness, and Mikhail Ostrog, a Russian criminal. However, no conclusive evidence linked him to any of the murders. The Ripper's killing spree abruptly ended after the murder of Mary Jane Kelly on November 9, 1888. But since Jack the Ripper was never caught, his true motives will remain hidden. But judging from his victims and the manner in which he carried out these gruesome killings, we can only speculate that he was a misogynistic, psychotic serial killer with a lot of mommy issues. April 1984. Richard Ramirez, known as the Night Stalker, would commit his very first murder. However, he was able to live his life without regret, even after being captured. Born February 29, 1960 in El Paso, Texas, Ricardo Leyva Munoz Ramirez's early life was fraught with violence and instability. Now, his father was pretty abusive, and young Richard was heavily influenced by his older cousin, Mike, a Vietnam War veteran who shared gruesome stories and photos of his wartime atrocities, further warping Ramirez's psyche. His criminal behavior would begin in his teens, with some petty crimes and drug use, but it would escalate to more violent offenses, and by 1984, he committed his first known murder, killing Mei Lung in the basement of a hotel in San Francisco. Now, this heinous act marked the beginning of a spree that would shock the nation. The Night Stalker attacks were characterized by their brutality and randomness. Ramirez picked out all kinds of ages, genders, and ethnicities, often breaking into homes in the dead of night. His methods were pretty gruesome, which would include shooting, stabbing, bludgeoning, and sexually assaulting his victims. He frequently mutilated those bodies and left satanic symbols at crime scenes. His reign of terror surely created widespread panic across California. The media dubbed him the Night Stalker, and his distinctive appearance, a gaunt figure with rotting teeth and dark penetrating eyes, became infamous. But despite his efforts to cover his tracks, Ramirez left behind crucial evidence, including finger and shoe prints, which eventually led to his capture. In August 1985, Ramirez's luck ran out. After his mugshot was broadcast on national TV, he was eventually recognized and chased by a mob in East Los Angeles. It was August 31st that he was apprehended and beaten by the residents before being arrested by the police. Now, his trial in 1988 was a spectacle, drawing massive media attention. His courtroom antics, including disturbing chants and flashing a pentagram tattooed on his palm, only added to his infamy. It was at this point that his major reason for committing the gruesome murders was attributed to Satan himself and sexual gratification. In September 1989, he was eventually convicted of 13 counts of murder, 5 counts of attempted murder, 11 counts of sexual assault, and 14 counts of burglary, and as a result, he was sentenced to death. Richard Ramirez spent the remainder of his life on death row at the San Quentin State Prison, where he eventually died of complications related to B-cell lymphoma on June 7, 2013, at the age of 53.
I have made peace with my Lord, and I have asked forgiveness. I am sorry that my acts of self-defense ended up in court like this.
November 30th, 1989. The infamous Eileen Wos claimed that Mallory beat, raped, and sodomized her, making her kill him in self-defense. However, this very murder led to the murder of 6 others, changing the narrative of her initial motive and the course of her life for the worse. Born February 29, 1956 in Rochester, Michigan, her father was a convicted child molester, and he hanged himself in prison, and her mother abandoned her and her brother Keith when Eileen was only 4 years old. So they were sent to their grandparents, who also subjected them to physical and sexual abuse. Now, by the age of 11, Wos was already engaging in sexual activities, surprise, surprise, for food, drugs, and even mere cigarettes. Her life of prostitution began early, leading to a turbulent adolescence marked by run-ins with the law. She gave birth to her son at the age of 14, who was put up for adoption not long after. Now, Eileen dropped out of school and would hitchhike across the country to continue her life as a prostitute. In 1986, Wos found herself in Florida, where she met Tyria Moore, a hotel maid who would become her lover and confidant. Their relationship was pretty intense and volatile, with Wos supporting him through her prostitution. It was during this time that Wos started to kill. Between late 1989 and late 1990, Wos murdered 7 men. The victims were Richard Mallory, David Spears, Charles Karskadin, Peter Sims, Troy Burress, Charles Humphreys, and Walter Gino Antonio. Now, she would pick up these middle-aged men in the middle of nowhere, working as a prostitute. Then she'd rob them and then shoot them with her .22 caliber pistol. Wuornos claimed that the killings, though, were in self-defense, alleging that the men had either raped or attempted to rape her. However, evidence suggested that robbery was a primary motive in many of the cases. Eventually, Wuornos was arrested on January 9, 1991, at a bar in Volusia County, Florida. Miss Moore, her lover, cooperated with the police, helping them gather evidence against Wuornos in exchange for immunity. Wuornos ultimately confessed to the murders but continued to claim self-defense. Her trial garnered massive media attention, mostly because of the sensational nature of the crimes and her status as a rare female serial killer. In 1992, Wuornos was convicted of first-degree murder for Richard Mallory and sentenced to death. She subsequently pled guilty to the other murders to avoid additional trials, receiving 6 more death sentences. So while on death row, Wuornos gave several interviews, during which she wavered between claiming self-defense and admitting to premeditated murder. Her mental state would decline over the years, and she showed signs of severe psychological distress. On October 9, 2002, Wuornos was executed by lethal injection in Florida, bringing an end to the existence of the Damsel of Death.
In light of all that has been used against me in the media, they've created this fantasy monster image, and it's been going on for the last 12 years.
January 3, 1972, John Wayne Gacy murdered Timothy McCoy and then buried him and covered it up with a layer of concrete. However, the most disturbing thing about Gacy was the deceptive and cunning nature that no one saw coming. Born March 17, 1942 in Chicago, Illinois, his wonderful childhood would include an abusive alcoholic father and a series of health issues, including a congenital heart condition. But despite these challenges, Gacy was active in community organizations like Boy Scouts and would show a rare talent for business tactics. He married Marilyn Myers in 1964 and moved to Waterloo, Iowa, where he managed several KFC restaurants owned by his father-in-law. However, his dark side soon emerged. It's 1968, and Gacy's convicted of sexually assaulting 2 teenage boys and sentenced to 10 years in prison. As the law would have it, he served only 18 months before being released for good behavior. And because of this conviction, he got a divorce from Marilyn. So he returned to Chicago, and he remarried, became a successful business contractor. He was well liked in the community, known for hosting neighborhood parties and dressing up like Pogo the Clown to entertain children at local events. It was this persona that later earned him the nickname the Killer Clown. Now, Gacy was very good at hiding his gruesome reality. Between 1972 and 78, he lured at least 33 men and boys to his house, where he sexually assaulted and killed them. Gacy would often pose as a police officer, or maybe offer his victims construction work to gain their trust. Once at his house, he handcuffed them, told them that he wanted to show them a magic trick before torturing and strangling them. He was said to have buried 26 of his victims in the crawl space under his house, and threw the others in the Des Plaines River. Gacy's downfall began in December 1978 when Robert Piest went missing. Piest was last seen with Gacy, leading police to investigate the contractor. They were horrified when they searched his house. The remains of so many people. After his arrest, as a result of his statement and eventual confessions, it was discovered that his acts were also primarily sexually motivated, as the principal action was the sexual thrill he received from the fear he instilled and the control he held over his victims. In 1980, Gacy was tried and convicted of 33 murders, the highest number of confirmed victims for any serial killer in U.S. history at the time. He was eventually sentenced to death and spent 14 years on death row, during which he flipped and painted his innocence, claiming that his victims had acted alone in the murders. But it didn't matter because on May 10, 1994, John Gacy was executed by lethal injection at Stateville Correctional Center in Illinois. His case remains one of the most chilling examples of the deceptive nature of many serial killers, whose outward appearances can really mask unimaginable horrors.
Accused killer Theodore Bundy was captured early this morning, 2 miles from Aspen, Colorado. He was on the main road driving a car he admitted taking just a short time earlier.
May 6, 1975. Ted Bundy met a girl named Lynette Dawn Culver, and instead of taking her home as he had promised, he drove her to his hotel, where he sexually assaulted her and drowned her in the bathtub. Lynette was one of 33 women killed by Bundy. Born November 24, 1946 in Burlington, Vermont, Ted was raised by his grandparents under the pretense that his mother was his sister. And Bundy initially exhibited early signs of troubling behavior, including the satisfaction of seeing the sexual acts of others and theft. But despite these early indicators, he was charming and intelligent, even getting a degree in psychology from the University of Washington. His brutal killing spree began in the 1970s, spanning through multiple states, including Washington, Oregon, Utah, Colorado, and Florida. Now, he would lure women by feigning an injury or maybe impersonating an authority figure, and then would advance to abducting, assaulting, and murdering them. He often revisited for some necrophilia and then would decapitate at least 12 of his victims, keeping their heads as trophies. His charming personality and meticulous planning aided Bundy's ability to evade capture. However, he was finally arrested in 1975 in Utah for possession of burglary tools. It would be subsequent investigations that linked him to several disappearances, leading to a 1976 conviction for kidnapping in Utah. But he manages 2 dramatic escapes from custody in 1977, the second of which allowed him to continue his killing spree in Florida. So while in Florida, Bundy attacked 4 women at Florida State University's Chi Omega sorority house, killing 2, after which he later abducted and murdered Kimberly Leach. His capture in February 1978 led to a highly publicized trial, where he would represent himself, exploiting his charisma to manipulate the media and courtroom. But even with all that charisma, Bundy was eventually convicted of the Chi Omega murders and sentenced to death in 1979, followed by another death sentence for Leach's murder in 1980. While on death row, Bundy confessed to 30 homicides, and that true number is set to be higher. Amid his various interviews, he stated that the biggest reason that made him delve into this vicious lifestyle was pornography. He was getting sexual pleasure from watching his victims in pain, coupled with the desire to always be in control of those victims, which would result in him killing them. His eventual execution by the electric chair took place on January 24, 1989, at the Florida State Prison.
Your Honor, it is over now. This has never been a case of trying to get free. I didn't ever want freedom.
Jeffrey Dahmer wasn't just a serial killer. He would also cannibalize, dismember, and keep the remains of his victims. But it's not a question about if he was a serial killer or not, but more of what drove him to commit such unthinkable acts. Born May 21, 1960 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Dahmer showed signs of disturbing behavioral patterns from a young age, including a fascination with dead animals and dissection, which seemed very strange. But his first murder would occur just after high school graduation in 1978, as he picked up a hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks and brought him home to kill him, dismember his body, and scatter the remains. After this initial crime, Dahmer's life was marked by alcoholism and arrests for various offenses, including indecent exposure and sexual assault. Unfortunately, his killing spree escalated in 1987 after he killed Stephen Toomey. Over the next 4 years, he lured men to his apartment with the promise of money or sex, and then he would drug, strangle, and often engage in necrophilia and cannibalism with their corpses. He meticulously preserved those body parts, keeping skulls and bones as disturbing trophies. He would like to drill holes into his victims' heads and inject them with acid or boiling water in futile attempts to create a submissive, zombie-like state. It's crazy, right? Dahmer's reign of terror ended on July 22, 1991, when Tracy Edwards managed to escape from his twisted apartment and flag down police. Once inside, authorities found pics of dismembered bodies and a refrigerator containing human remains, which led to Dahmer's eventual arrest. During his 92 trial, Dahmer was found guilty of 15 of those murders and sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms in prison. He did express remorse, cooperating with investigators and the authorities as he would give graphic detail about how he carried out his gruesome acts. But it didn't matter because the whole nation was already shocked and horrified. From his statements, though, we discovered that he enjoyed having control over his victims, leading him to enjoy these gruesome acts of necrophilia after their deaths, which he would carry on further to cannibalize So on November 28, 1994, Dahmer would get the justice he seemed to deserve, but not in the hands of the law. He was killed by a fellow inmate, Christopher Scarver, at the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin.